Hello, and welcome to Biblical Hermeneutics, Bible 2223, Week 1, Lecture 4. In our last lecture, we discussed the importance of the historical cultural context. It is imperative to include this study in your final exegetical paper. Another area of contextual study that you will need to include in your final paper is the literary context. Before we turn our attention to literary context, let's refresh ourselves on requirements of proper hermeneutics. Hermeneutical guidelines arise from and address some essential facets for overcoming barriers in the Bible. We are looking at particular tools that potentially help us better understand what we are going to see in Scripture. For communication to occur, the recipients, the original and the modern audience, must understand the passage consistent with the indicators that are there within the passage. There are some things working as indicators within the text that are pointing us to what a sound interpretation is going to look like. We look at the literary context. We look at the historical background. We consider word meanings, how grammar and syntax is developed within that passage. And finally, literary genre is going to play somewhat of a role. Regardless of literary genre, for any interpretation to be true, it must be consistent with the literary context. What is the flow of thought within a specific passage within the overall book? What is going to be consistent within the historical background? What is the main common sense meaning of a word within the text? Finally, proper grammar. Those are all giving us indicators as how to understand the biblical passage. If our interpretation does not fit in all four areas, then it is quite possible and likely that our interpretation is wrong. Context determines meaning. I cannot stress this enough. The context of any passage determines the meaning. Literary context is part of interpretation. A basic principle of biblical hermeneutics is that the intended meaning of any passage is the meaning that is consistent with the sense of the literary context in which it occurs. I'll say that again. A basic principle of biblical hermeneutics is that the intended meaning of any passage is the meaning that is consistent with the sense of the literary context in which it occurs. A passage occurs within a context of other stories and other passages. It's a unit within a whole, for example. The literary context is a basic, for if not the most important principle for interpretation. As in standard literature, the context is anything that comes immediately before and immediately after the passage. Do not take a passage out of context, out of the flow of thought within which that story is found. Context provides flow of thought. Context is going to provide an umbrella for you. We tend to recognize when it is abused in other sources, but we do not always recognize when it is abused in Scripture. So, if we were to say, I heard an interesting story on the news the other night. The quarterback faded back to past carbon buildup was keeping the carburetor from functioning properly. The 2-inch thick stakes were burned on the outside, but raw on the inside. 2 feet high snowdrifts, the grass needed mowing, the elevator raced to the top of the 100-foot building. The audience booed the poor performer. I heard all of that on the news last night. What is obviously wrong there? Very obviously, these are all one-liners taken out of context. So when we see that, we immediately think that that doesn't make a lick of sense. You obviously did something very wrong when you were listening to the news. Yet, we tend to allow that to be accepted in Scripture, where we take a piecemeal approach, so to speak. We take pieces of this passage, and we put them together to make a point. That does not always give us the best possible interpretation of a text. Grammatically, in that previous paragraph, there was nothing wrong with those sentences. What was wrong was the context of those sentences and the way they were put together. Yet people tend to take unrelated ideas in Scripture and put them together in order to form a new idea. That is an abuse of Scripture. One of the somewhat fun but unfortunate things that we can do with Scripture is just about any idea out there. If you proof text it enough, you can find some way to support it in Scripture. The second reason why an interpretation must agree with the general message of the context derives from the nature of words. If I were to have this sentence, "That was the largest trunk I ever saw," and there was no context to give bearing as to what that is related to, then perhaps it refers to many different things. Is it a trunk referring to luggage? Is it a tree? Is it the rear storage of a car or the nose of an elephant? Without any kind of context, it could be any number of things. On the other hand, if I give a context and I say, "At the zoo, Billy ran up to the cage and exclaimed, 'That is the largest trunk I ever saw.'" Now at least I have a context. Now, is it possible he is referring to a tree rather than an elephant? It is possible. He runs up to the cage, and in that cage he sees a tree and says, "That is the largest trunk I ever saw." That is a possibility, but in this context, given that he is at the zoo and standing in front of a cage, I'm going to make an educated guess and say that he is talking about an elephant. So that is what we are doing sometimes in regards to Scripture. Context is going to give us bearings as to what is likely the particular understanding of a particular passage or sentence. Taking them out of context tends to open them up so we can say, well, this could be applied to lots of different things. It is important that each term is understood according to what is consistent with its own literary context. A third reason why correct interpretation must be consistent is because most biblical books are written and preserved as complete documents intended to be read as a single unit. Biblical verses do not exist as isolated, independent entities. One of the great things about chapters and verses is that they help us memorize Scripture, and they help us locate Scripture more readily. But we should recognize that chapters and verses did not come until much later in church history. They are not part of inspired Scripture. Originally, these manuscripts had no chapters and verses, and when they read those, they would sit and read the entire scroll in one sitting. Original audiences did not have the problem of taking something out of context because the context was all they ever heard. Chapters and verses are good, but they can lead us to abuse what is going on. Detached from their context, individual verses can take on meaning that the writers never intended. This is called proof texting. To qualify as the text's intended meaning, an interpretation must be compatible with the total thought of the immediate context and the book context. Proof texting is quoting a biblical passage to prove a doctrine or a standard without regard to literary context. We do this all the time without realizing that we do it. Most often, it is unintentional. We think we are doing a really great job, but we are taking something and forcing it to bear light on something else that it was never intended to speak to. Here's an example using Scripture to say that suicide would be permitted. So if we take these verses and string them together, we can make it say, Judas went and hung himself. Jesus said, "Go and do likewise. What you are about to do, go and do quickly." Obviously, we know if we were to read those in context, they are not speaking on this subject whatsoever. But you can take sentences and passages and string them together in order to produce something that Scripture never said. Context is what you have in order to guide the interpretation to make sure things are not pieced together incorrectly. To balance that, there are many scriptures that speak on the same message, and to take different passages that are speaking in their context on the same thing to give greater support would be different. Just because things are put together from different passages does not automatically mean that it is wrong. It definitely means that if I am hearing it in a sermon or I am reading it in a book and I am noticing that he took Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Matthew, that is one of those red flags that automatically goes up to say these things are pieced together. I immediately go to those contexts and I read what the context is in that passage and where it comes in. I am reading it to make sure that they are saying the same thing and they are not just sentences that sound good together. This is what the church of Berea did when Paul came and preached to them and preached the gospel. It sounded good, but the Bereans said, you know what? We're going to go and search the scriptures, find what you're describing, look at this context, and determine that for ourselves. And they did, and they believed him. Here's another example. What is the context of this verse? Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Is Paul talking about a literal harvest, or is something else going on in the text? Context will help you determine that Paul is using harvest in a non-literal sense. What about the context of 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22? Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Commonly, this verse is used to encourage teenagers to flee from sexual temptation. However, in context, Paul is writing to Timothy, who is combating the problem of false teachers within the leadership of the Ephesian church. Context must determine the meaning. I'll say that again. This is another kind of a big rule within hermeneutics. Context must determine the meaning. Now, we need to look at pretext. This is a passage that seems on the surface to prove some belief, but in actuality, it does not. An example is Romans 8:28. We know that all things God works together for the good of those who have been called according to his purpose. How has this been abused? Everything you come against in your life, God is going to make good. Well, there's theological danger in that. Let's look at what Paul is saying. All things are not good. What he is saying is that God will accomplish his salvific purpose. He will bring it to salvation. God will bring that person to salvation and move that person towards salvation. In the context in which he is talking about, he is dealing with that particular topic. God does not say he is going to take every single thing in your life and make it good. There are some bad things that just may stay bad, but God will give you the character and the perseverance that you will need in order to persevere or deal with whatever is deemed bad. Focusing on the meaning of a paragraph or a larger context is what safeguards or helps us not take a single verse out of context and apply it to something that it is not speaking to. A general rule is the smaller the text, the greater the possibility of an erroneous interpretation. I'll say that again. A general rule is the smaller the text, the greater the possibility of an erroneous interpretation. Maybe in your own devotion time or in a Sunday school class, you focus on one verse, just meditating on it and really letting that saturate. And that is fine. But somewhere in that meditation, as you are looking at that one verse, go ahead and read the greater context so you know what is going on in the greater flow of thought. That way, you make sure you're not taking it and applying it to something that it never applies to in the context. Remember, context defines meaning. Here we have the circles of contextual study. First of all, you will have the specific text located in the center. Then we go out and what is surrounding it. Then you go out to the book as a whole. Then you ask, Does this author write anything else on this topic in any other book? So if it is Paul, does he write anything else on the subject? If it is Luke, does he say anything else on the subject in the Gospel of Luke or in the book of Acts? What else do we know about what he might have to say? What does the rest of the New Testament say? What does all of Scripture say? You may not do that every time, but that is just a general rule of study. Immediate context is the material presented immediately before and after the passage under study. So for example, let's say you're reading Romans chapter 7. The immediate context would be Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 8. In most instances, this will be the preceding and succeeding paragraphs. By paying attention to this level of context, you can eliminate 75% of interpretive mistakes. The context of the book is where we will discover its genre. Is it poetry? Is it prophecy? Is it a narrative? That is going to have bearing on how certain words are interpreted. This is particularly true of imagery. What are 3 things that can be learned from the context of a book? First is the book's purpose and controlling themes. For instance, for the first several chapters of Romans, Paul is talking about justification by faith. I am justified by faith. Everything that he is saying in supporting that thesis, that we are justified by faith. So that is the controlling theme of those verses. In Corinthians, you have a theme that Paul is trying to present, that all worship is orderly. He talks about speaking in tongues and how women function in the church and prophecy. All of that is coming under orderly worship. So that is the controlling theme of all these other passages that we may take out and look at individually. The second thing that I can find is the overall outline or the flow of thought of the whole book. Not the passage, the book. Third, I might gain insight from parallel passages within the book that deal with the same subject. Here, we have an example of topical preaching. Though this is a legitimate method of preaching, I've been trained on it. Some of you may be pastors and you may preach topically. Often, this method can distort the meaning of a passage of Scripture or Scripture in its entirety by disregarding the literary context of the individual passages. Notice that the sermon jumps from John to Psalms to Acts to arrive at the point of the sermon. As long as proper care is taken to ensure that the literary context of each book is respected, then this is an okay method of preaching. In contrast to topical, which is characterized by jumping around in the biblical text, expository preaching focuses on a single section in one book of the Bible, often a few verses in a chapter or the chapter itself. This method better enables the interpreter to maintain the flow of thought and helps to aid in the interpretation of the passage. Notice in the example that the sermon is drawn out of John's intended purpose for John 10. In conclusion, literary context is very important for a proper understanding of the biblical text. It is important that interpreters respect and pay attention to all of the controlling features of contextual study.